A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here with Dr. Bram De Ridder, who's a postdoctoral research in applied history at the University of Leuven, Belgium. He's performed extensive research into the topics of public and applied history and has advised numerous organizations on how to better use the past. I love that term, by the way, use the past. His research has also studied how game developers and gamers relate to the past, leading him to found Sunken Tower, a history and game design company. Currently, he mainly plays Crusader Kings 3, which we talked about right before this program, where he's trying to turn the Dukes of Brabant into the leading European power. All right, Bram, welcome to the show. Yeah!
Thank you for having me.
All right, so when I think of representing history in games, right, the first thing that always comes to mind is the possibility of misrepresentation. Right. And in fact, whenever we're talking about reality, and Andy and I have talked about this in our program before, misrepresentation is always kind of the first thing. Are we misrepresenting reality? And I think about how many people learn history these days from films, right? And films that change the truth to tell a better story, right? And games can also teach us things about history, right? People can learn things from history from games, and they can learn things that are just wrong in order for the game to be more fun. And this is where you get the confluence of something that might be educational, but really its primary purpose is entertainment. We'll go back to the matter of whether or when video games actually need to show us the truth about history. But first up, we really need to ask kind of, what does it mean to tell the truth about a historical event or period or practice or life?
Right. Thank you. Great question. It's actually also the question that I get the most. So whenever I talk about history and games, especially when you talk to indie game developers and they reach out to me like, okay, you're a historian, what can you do for us? It's usually they say, we want to represent the past as correctly as possible. We want to get it right, whether you want to call that the truth or not, but we want to get it right. And usually the first answer that I give them, you're not going to get it right. No. It's impossible because I've been a professional academic historian for over 10 years now, and even professional academics don't get it right. I won't get into too much detail, but the thing that historians are most aware of, the only real truth about history is the sources, the historical sources and what you read in them, but only in one source. If I, as a historian, if I combine two sources, one from that archive and one from an archive that's a bit further, I'm already making a construction that is not really what the past was like. I'm combining these things. So even historians, when you read a historical book, when you watch a historical movie, even if it says like, this is the truth, it's actually a construct, a representation of the past. It's not the actual past. It's not really truth. It's at most what we hope, what we think, what could have been true. So one of the game developers that I talked to really got into trouble with it. He was dealing with mythology and so on. I was like, I don't know how I get this right. One historian saying A and one historian saying B and a third one is saying A plus, and I don't know what is real and what is not real anymore. That is fairly normal. What you need to do as a game developer is pick a truth that works for you, that works for your game, and that can be as close as possible to what we know about the past, or it can be completely removed from it and you can do something creative with it. It's up to you, and I can help you make that choice, but don't hire me to tell you what truth is. I'll give you a bunch of sources and you can read them and you can integrate them in the game, but that's not what you are really wanting to do. So it's very hard to say like, what is the truth, what you want to do with it? It's not there. I'm not going to help you find it.
Then let's turn that on its head, right? At the same time, it's not like you're telling people create your own version of the truth. Right. So instead, you're picking out some sort of reasonable interpretation. Yeah, exactly. And as historians, as academic historians, we try to make that as correct as possible. So you have a whole methodology to do that.
There's a lot of debate about it, but it's fairly clear how you can do that. The thing with games is they're creative, they're supposed to be fun. They have all of these other interests than just tell what the past was like. You want to do something more with that. So your method becomes different. And again, it's then up to the gaming company to make a decision, a well-informed decision, hopefully. And that's where I try to help in some cases about, okay, this is how we're going to use the past. This is how we're going to show it. We're going to try to stay as close as possible to these certain elements. And here we're going to change things for that and for that reason. And you need to know what those reasons are. But more than that is not really plausible. And you see a lot of different games that take different approaches to that.
Right. So how would you go about doing it unethically? It sounds like you have such a wide pathway ahead of you. If you just want to use history, how could I get it wrong?
That's a good question. It's one that historians have grappled with themselves. In terms of gaming, I would say if you hide what you're doing. So if you are saying something like, this is the historical truth. This is undeniably how it was. We're the most believable historical game. If you play what we offer you, you get the most realistic experience of what that period and time frame was possible. You have to take that with a pinch of salt, I would say. So you would need to acknowledge that you make choices, that the fun is first and then the accuracy is second, which most companies do acknowledge. But don't make claims that you know are not true. Do not try to make something a historical truth that you know is not true. And in certain cases, that diversion is minute. It can be very small. In other cases, it can be very large. And that becomes a problem. That's one possible answer to your question.
So it's interesting. What you're pointing to is the unethical part that you're concerned about. It might be that the game itself is misrepresenting to the player how truthful the game actually is. And that itself is really interesting. So this idea of misrepresentation. So we have two levels of potential misrepresentation. One is the game misrepresenting history, right? And for this, you've told us that, well, there are different ideas about how we're trying to reconstruct what things were like, though at the same time, you can't just say it was like this based on nothing at all, right? But then the other issue is, the communication between the game and the player itself misrepresentative, right? Can we start with some sort of clear case where a game might show you the truth according to some respectable historian about an historical event, and also like a situation, a case where the game misrepresents the truth entirely of how things were, right? And these could be either actual or hypothetical. If you want to make some up, that's fine. If you want to go to actual real game, that's fine.
Well, I'll give you 3 examples, and they're sort of different examples. So
right.
The one thing that you really pointed out, like, this is where we believe the experts and we bring them in. I would say, let's go for Age of Empires. Age of Empires 4, where you have all of these video clips that are shown with footage of castles and people explaining how a crossbow works and how a trebuchet works. That is really a claim that Age of Empires is making. We are the most trustworthy historical game. We're trying to learn you something about history as well. Which is fine. I mean, the clips are something different from the game content, but the game content itself, I mean, medieval wars were not waged as in Age of Empires. It's a fun game to play. I love to play it, but by playing it, you're not really learning medieval strategy.
Right.
Videos might help that, but you're not really learning it through the game. And then you have what you already mentioned, Crusader Kings 3, which I absolutely adore. Bunny, we were talking earlier, you mentioned that it's absolutely a pitfall regarding time.
Yes,
I think it's my third attempt in making the Dukes of Brabant. I live in the old Duchy of Brabant. That I try to make them into a real empire. I usually fail, but I love that. It's slightly earlier in terms of period than the historian or the academic work on history that I did. But the gameplay mechanics, I find them fascinating, and they really work well. They're simplified. There are, of course, choices that have been made, but I've worked a lot with pre-modern dynastic history, and I love what I'm seeing. I mean, I really relate to how that game works. I can point out like, okay, this is how it would have worked. And to make that even more specific and concrete, I have a colleague who graduated with her PhD on dynastic history and marriage strategies last year. And she introduced her PhD defense with footage from Crusader Kings 3.
Okay.
So it's not the video clips that are added to the gameplay that make it accurate or believable or truthful. It's actually the gameplay itself that I feel is really interesting and can teach you something. If I'm correct, Crusader Kings is also used in a class at the University of Antwerp, just to point that out.
Okay.
Is it because of the whole... So Crusader Kings, Andy, I don't know if you know this, one of the really interesting things about it is you're used to the idea of I'm going to conquer the world, right, with my armies. But so much of the strategy of Crusader Kings is choosing who to marry your kids off to. And so is that part, really mimicking history in terms of how power works?
Yeah, it's for me, it's fascinating. I did a bit of research on YouTube. Before I bought a game to know what it was about, and that was really the part that I loved. Okay, there is a combat aspect, and when you play it, I think combat is still one of the main strategies that you can use to expand your realm. It was a mistake I made in one of the first places. I waited too long to go on the military route. But you can do a lot through family strategy, and it's indeed management. Like, do I marry my daughter off to this other duke that I might need in an alliance, or do I marry her off to a count somewhere, if I'm in Brabant here in Belgium, to a count in England, where she might start her own family, and I have a sub-branch of my own family sprawling up in England that I can support, and maybe one of her grandchildren or great-grandchildren that is of my dynasty might take over the English throne. That is a fairly, it's simple, again, it's simplified, but it gives a fairly realistic, or recognizable, and we'll get back to that term, a fairly recognizable thing for me as an academic historian of what a noble family in pre-modern days would be concerned with how to manage the family.
Does this mean that if we have a game that doesn't have that marriage, using marriage for power and alliances kind of aspect to it, is in some sense misrepresenting how power works by focusing only on military power?
Yeah, for sure. And again, Crusader Kings will have its own misrepresentations, and I don't want to keep hammering on that nail, but no historical product gets the full truth or the full representation right. It's about the choices. And what makes Crusader Kings, to me, more interesting in terms of gameplay dynamics, for example, as history, compared to Age of Empires, is that they got more right. That they didn't get everything. They make mistakes probably. They make choices in function of their gameplay to keep it playable. But it is, for me, very fun to be doing the things, or more of the things than usual in other games, that I see people in the sources do. I can do things as the Duke of Brabant that a historical Duke of Brabant might have been doing in order to further the dynasty and further the realm.
And is this you mentioned that there was a class at the University of Antwerp that teaches presumably history using this game, right? That's okay, even though you know that the game is not completely accurate.
Yeah, I think it speaks to what the developers did. I didn't follow the class. I know the colleague, but I don't know specifically what the class is about and what it tries to teach. But I think it speaks to what the developers at Paradox achieved, that you have an academic historian who says, like, okay, I can use this game to really clarify some of the things that I want my students to understand about how a pre-modern political system would have worked.
Mm-hmm.
What about a game that just is a clear case where, look, the game just misrepresents the truth? You're told this is history, but the history, what you're being shown is so far off the mark that you just want to say, look, this is just really not the truth.
I've tried to look for those cases. I would say that there are not too many of those. Again, and that comes back to what we discussed earlier. Most games are fairly honest about what they want to do with history.
Right.
I think, and maybe you've thought of these cases yourself when we were preparing this, I think two of the cases that we almost need to discuss in a context like this are Battlefield 5 and Kingdom Come Deliverance. Battlefield 5 that was ill-received at the beginning. For one reason, the trailers weren't clear about, is this a serious history game or is this a warped take on World War II history?
Right.
The game didn't communicate that clearly at first, and then when it appeared through the communication from the company that, okay, this is, we try to highlight some of the understudied or undershown aspects of World War II history, particular female combatants. And then you get a whole discussion about, is that accurate or is that not accurate?
Right.
And the problem is not, I think, I haven't played the game. I didn't follow the case very closely, but the problem is not necessarily that you cannot make a game about female combatants in World War II, or not that you cannot include them, because you will find cases of female combatants in World War II in different worlds. The thing is what the company is trying to do. Are they trying to sell this as a major aspect of history, which it probably wasn't? Or are they trying to sell this as another take, an alternative version that puts more stress on that? And I think the problem was a disconnect between what players expected, what the initial trailer showed, what the company then communicated, and what the game actually did in terms of the game itself. So that is not a case of abject, complete misrepresentation. It's a case of a company not really being aware of what it's doing. I'm guessing here. I don't know internally inside the company what happened. But it seems that there could have been a disconnect between what they were making, what they were trying to tell, what they were actually telling, and what people expected. And all of these people involved with those four steps have a different take on what the historical truth is. And I'm not the one who's going to judge what the actual truth is. I can just say you mismanaged that whole chain of communicating what you're doing with history.
Right. And from my point of view of working in these organizations, I can absolutely imagine how that would happen. I can absolutely imagine how because frequently marketing is very much disconnected from the development of the games, where marketing gets the wrong idea and presents, and that's the outgoing messaging comes from marketing in terms of clips that they use to promote the game, and this is why I think it's really important for game designers to be very involved in the marketing, just so that your marketing stays on message. Whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish with the game is also accomplished in the marketing part of it.
I'm thinking also of that. It's by the way, this is interesting because as not a game designer, I didn't know that, Andy. And I assumed
nobody would know.
I assumed it's all internal to the company, and of course, everybody knows what's going on, and of course, this is a strategy that everybody understands. But It makes sense that it isn't.
And a big company is, the bigger the company, the less monolithic they are.
Right. So it's interesting because I remember, if I remember this correctly, this was the game was being more inclusive, right? And this was a kind of, and the criticism was, look, this essentially they took this and they try to make it more PC by having, minorities and women also take part in it. But what they did was essentially, misrepresented the reality of World War II in a ridiculous way, and it ruined the game. And it's interesting how particularly these attempts to be more inclusive in a world where you want to give the player the opportunity to have characters that represent who they are, but in a historical world where men, and especially, if we're in Europe, white men, had, a lot more power and privilege to go out and do things. So they're your obvious characters to play. What do you think, Bram, is a balance that makes sense responsibly if you're creating a historical game where you are trying to bring in that diversity element?
The easy answer on my part is it's a case-by-case basis that you need to judge, which is not really an answer. Right. I know. Right. I think I'll go around it with a slight detour and see if I can come up with a real answer in the meantime. But one thing is that, let's say, diversity and inclusion, they matter. Because if you're not paying attention to them, and I've seen this happen with some of the companies that I've talked to, you sort of you quickly end up in a direction that is very male-centric, that makes, or that even directs into, let's say, a representation of history that is more tyrannical, I'll use that word, than you would actually have imagined when you started. So if you're not paying attention to these things, you end up in a place that I don't think you want to be ethically, and in terms of climate today as well.
Wait, are you saying that you're also misrepresenting history by making it be even more male-centric, or did I misunderstand that?
No, I think that's correct. And again, it depends on the history that you're using. So if you would ask me as a historian, like we're going to work with this period, let's take World War II, then it's up to me to, and I'll draft you a schedule of what that looked like, and then you can either say, okay, we'll pay attention to certain elements, and those can be either more diverse and inclusive, or they can end up in a more male-centered way. To make this very concrete, we've talked to an indie developer about World War II who was working on a game, and we made a remark, but there are no people of color in your game. And his response was, yeah, I know this is important, I may pay attention to this later, but in terms of the actual concrete historical case that I was looking at, no people of that case, or no persons involved with that case, were people of color. It wasn't historically, it's an all-white group that I'm looking at. Okay, that can be true. If you want to stay truthful to that, fine. But then there are other ways you can have that group interact with other groups where people of color were included historically. So you can use history as an excuse to end up with something that is very white and very male and be historically accurate. And then you can have other choices that still are truthful to that keep that intact. But in terms of a narrative way, you are free. I mean, you don't have to stick 100% to what happened as a game developer. There are narrative techniques, there are gameplay techniques to have those people of color, female players, whatever you want to include in terms of minorities or other groups, you can have them visually present. You don't have to make your game entirely white because the primary group that you were looking at was white. The reverse is also true. If you then say, okay, we want to focus on this group, but it was too white and too male, we'll add people of color, we'll add a couple of female combatants. Okay, you can do that. But then be upfront with it that it's not a historical truth. So don't try to sell that as we're trying to be extremely truthful. Say, we're taking this from history and we've added this for diversity and inclusion rates. And I think that will be fine. But don't take those changes and then say, oh, this is how history was, because there might have been another regiment or another group where that was the truth, or there were, let's say there were on average 5 female combatants out of 100. Those would have been dispersed out over an entire battlefield. Don't put those 5 in that same group in your game in order to up the numbers and make it more diverse. All right, you could do that, but then don't claim that you're historically accurate. You weren't.
Right.
So it's interesting, right? Because you've got this concern that the player wants to know how historically accurate the game is, or what is historically accurate. But before starting a game, I've never played a game where the game told me anything about that. So where is this communication supposed to happen? That's supposed to be this kind of honest communication. Is this in the marketing? Is this some sort of not content warning, but something that you're supposed to get in the beginning of the game? Is this the kind of thing that could be covered with just some of the events are based on facts, which is an ambiguous statement that doesn't tell us anything?
Well, it depends a bit on the game. One thing is franchises, or sequels. Let's take Battlefield 5. One of the main issues was Battlefield 5 is the 5th installment. Players have a certain expectation. You change that without explanation, without very clear communication, and people are disappointed because it's not what they expected from that series. It's the same with Age of Empires. Let's take Age of Empires, and all of a sudden, without any major announcement, you get a completely warped version of history where things are changed, where none of it makes sense, or there is not that connection with history anymore that they have now. and you would be disappointed as a player. You are pleased that there are those video clips you used from Age of Empires 2. You have these large descriptions with historical information that you could scroll through, which gives a sentiment of, okay, I learned something about history. Okay, my game is fun, but on the side I can learn something. If they change that, you're going to be disappointed as a player. Same with Crusader Kings, all of these series that have a number behind it. So don't change what you're doing unless you're prepared to take a very big risk, which is what happened with Battlefield. If you're a new game, then I think it's marketing. Then you have to be very clear, and your marketing people have to be very well in touch, as you mentioned, Andy, with the people making the actual development, that there is no disconnect. And that what you show, what people can expect through trailers, through previews, pre-plays, that they know what they're going to get. And you're not going to get players who expect something historically accurate if the game is and they want that, if it's not that type of game. There you have just to be very clear. Don't create the disconnect either from the beginning or when you're at number 5.
So I would say most games are going to use a historical setting, right? They may not even try to bring in historically accurate characters. They're just going to say, we know that this setting exists. We know that the kinds of people who are in this setting, and we're just going to try to do our best with that, right? So I'm having trouble. I'm honestly having a hard time sort of wrapping my head around this whole concept, right? Like, where can that seems like the most common thing that people are going to do in game development. We're going to pick a setting. We're going to drop people who we think are the kinds of people who are in that setting into that setting, and run with it. Where can we go wrong? I'm still trying to wrap my head around, like, how is that even problematic?
Right, because notice, Bram, because it's one thing if the players might be disappointed, but it's another thing of like, where is it going to be like the developers are really doing something wrong and misrepresenting what they're doing to the players?
I'll answer that through some of the realities of historical game development. And I think that might help you wrap your head around what is going on.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that when you speak to most developers, and here I should mention that we've had a student, I really need to mention his name, Yuri Kath. He spoke to a lot of people about this. Why are you using history for your game? I mean, it can be tricky, as we've seen. There is a reality people expect, or if they think that they know what historical reality is, they get into debate. Why don't you just create a completely fictional universe? No problems whatsoever. Wouldn't that be simpler? The reason why you pick a historical game is because it resonates with people. There are two reasons. One is that it resonates. So people have, why am I playing Crusader Kings 3? Because I'm a historian and I recognize certain things professionally, or that I'm interested in. For other people, that might be something that they've seen in a movie, something in a book, connections with their parents, or just a general interest in history. Why am I playing the Duke of Brabant? Because I live in Brabant. It resonates with me, so I'm playing with it. That's a very powerful emotion that the game developers with history games tap into. It is not fictional. It is real. There's always this element of it is real, it is truthful, even when it becomes sort of more fictional. The other thing is, it is easier to explain. I had a developer explain this very well to me. You don't have to explain the development of from leather armor to chainmail to plate armor. People more or less know what happens. Now, if I have the Zorf armor that becomes the Dwarf armor, you need to explain that. People need to take it at face value,
Mm-hmm.
or you need to explain it somewhere. The other thing is they have a sentiment already. There's inherent knowledge, and that is what makes historical games.
That's right. It's a kind of shorthand, right? I can just say, this is set in World War II, and now we know a lot of stuff about this game just by me saying that.
Yeah. So, and that is really something that you need to understand, and that I hope that listeners to your podcast who are interested in history games also understand. The game is not there to be historically accurate. It is not there to tell you something about history. It is interesting for developers to do that because you're interested in, and it makes it, you have the resonance, you have the recognizability.
Right. And
But also
I'm going to put a caveat on that. There are games where that is the point. Right. There are serious games about history that are being made to try
Yeah,
to like literally
sure.
try to teach. But we're talking about
For sure.
when we're talking about this, we're talking about popular games that are meant to be
Popular games,
played for the
And-
fun of playing them.
Yeah, and we've also spoken to players, and the developers know this very well as well. The fun part is the most important one. Whatever you do with history, it needs to be fun, and everything else needs to be built around making it fun. And every choice that you make needs to get to that goal first, which is interesting from an ethics point of view.
Yeah, from an ethics point of view, you might see that a little bit differently, right? That from a sales perspective or from a game design perspective, if you want a game to be successful, you want to make it fun unless you're trying to make a serious game, which with a different sort of point, or as Andy likes to say, a different kind of fun. But from the ethics perspective, you're going to have, if I'm going to make a World War II game that puts you in the position of Nazis having a lot of fun, essentially doing whatever they want with Jews in concentration camps, or if I'm going to essentially make a super racist Chinese version of World War II, where the Japanese are essentially inhuman animals, the ethics starts to really matter, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely you're spot on. You're spot on. It's the things I described are usually the basics. It's what makes why choices are made, why you start developing a history game. But you're right. History has a tendency to get back at you. So you can't do everything with it. And you really need to wonder at what point you're doing things to history that you shouldn't be doing. And a lot of the things that I've been saying point to there is an immense amount of flexibility as long as you're upfront about it. But of course, there are choices that become more problematic. And one in a lot of World War II games is I'm not sure that's still the correct term, but politically correct term, but let's say the Holocaust. You're making a World War II game. Are you gonna reference the Holocaust? Are you gonna show it? Are you gonna mention it? Or are you gonna keep it out? And in a lot of cases, the choice, and it was interesting, one developer was confronted with that choice. Are we gonna include the Holocaust in our World War II game?
Mm-hmm.
Said to us, we eventually skipped it. We got a bit of criticism for that, and we get sometimes questions about it. They expected the question when we talked to them. But he said there was no way we could, I don't know if they use the word ethically in the note, but we could not get that element in a right, proper, good manner into the game, we felt. So we skipped it. Right. We couldn't do it right. We couldn't do it ethically, and that can vary from one person and one company to another. But they said it is impossible to do that in a good manner. So we skipped it. And I think that in a lot of historical games, you see that is what happens. If there is an ethical question to be made about history, a really hard ethical question, they prefer to go around it and prefer to say, we're not going to touch it. Mm-hmm. We're not going to come down on either side. We're just gonna leave it out.
Is that the right thing to do, in your opinion?
I think I agree with the company that if you don't find an answer that you like, that you can defend, that you can stand behind and say, this is why we did it for these and these and these reasons, and this is why we think it's ethical. If you can't explain that to yourself, I don't think you need to feel obliged to explain it to others. And then as long as you're willing to admit, like, we were not able to get this right, so we excluded it.
To me, the context, there's so many contextual elements here that would need to go in. What's the tone of the game? All right. For example, what's the perspective? For example, let's say, we have a Saving Private Ryan kind of, game. So, right, you're landing in Normandy. Right, the Americans know nothing. So
it's realistic looking. It's not cartoony.
Right.
Okay,
it's realistic. It's not cartoony, and only at the end of the movie do you actually get the concentration camps, right? Because they're not thinking about stuff and they don't really know about that stuff from what I understand. On the but if they are going to get to Germany, and if they have been making it a serious game, how could you not deal with the Holocaust? But if you've made like a cartoony fun game, it seems like you couldn't represent it in a serious manner that would represent it accurately anyway, without ruining the game. But I'm thinking also about all these kind of sensitive historical topics, like the front in World War II between the Chinese and Japanese, and how much this is history that is still very much when we talk about medieval history, did they wear the right armor or not? That really doesn't. There's not much at stake. But if you're talking about the relationships between China, Japan, and South Korea, World War II is still very much an issue, all right?
And even incidents before that, Age of Empires got into trouble with that the older series, the original series, didn't pay much attention to those sensitivities because it wasn't as big a market for them as it is now. So now they're sort of struggling with the fact that they've picked terms, that they've picked technologies, tech trees, which don't really fit the political and historical narratives of those countries. But even there, do understand that there is, again, a historical reality to those conflicts, and you can come in and say, like, okay, this seems to be wrong based on historical evidence, and this seems to be right. But a lot of the sensitivities in the discussions are not about right and wrong. It's about, is it the Chinese version that's correct, or is it the Korean version, or is it the Japanese version for the conflicts over the past 500 years? And then even me as a historian, I'm saying, like, this is a political conflict, and I can help you navigate that as a company, but you have to make the choice whether or not you're going to use the Chinese term for the war, the Korean term, the Japanese term, or you're going to just name it something else to avoid the conflict entirely.
Right. And, and this is where I would think financial pressures like the Chinese market, assuming that China actually lets you put their game there, but the size of the Chinese market could put potential, create conflicts of interest in kind of which version of the story you tell.
Yeah. Can I give just one more example?
Yeah.
A very small one that illustrates the importance of market and targeting. There is a game that won prizes in Belgium, Brukel. It's developed by Bob De Ridder. He's currently a professor, I think, in Boston. And the game is about his grandmother, how she experienced World War II. And it is interesting for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons why it won a prize was because it could show the horrors of a person experiencing World War II as a child from her own home, her own dialect is included, and so on. It's a very personal game showing the horror of war. When it went on Steam, it was sold or presented as a game showing the horror of war. People from Eastern Europe downloaded the game and said, is this the horror of war? This is a person who is afraid of bombardments and sometimes Nazis walking by. And there is one battle that happens sort of in the vicinity of her house. If your grandmother lost her 5 brothers and sisters due to starvation, and your other uncle, his grandfather, and his 3 brothers were shot brutally in the very worst war that happened in Eastern Europe compared to here in Belgium during World War II. Right. That is not showing the atrocities of World War II. So there is a mismatch between what the game claims to be in Belgium, an accurate representation of the horrors of World War II, and then people in Eastern Europe saying, you're completely not accurately representing the horrors of World War II.
Right.
So that is, again, where you need, as a company, to be very clear in your marketing and targeting.
Yeah, that's interesting, because God, a game where the point is to showcase the horrors. I mean, there's games that showcase like this War of Mine, right? The horrors of war, but it's very clear that they're showing it from a very kind of limited perspective. And it's interesting with this War of Mine, he wanted to make you feel like this could be potentially any city in the world, that this could happen to, right? But if it's a historical event, it can't be any city in the world.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be this,
exactly.
right? This specific place. So, so what do you, so it seems to me that this problem of communication is a really difficult one. Unless, Andy, I'm misunderstanding the ability to communicate here, but
No,
it's
I
like,
think
how specific do you need to get in these communications?
I think the specificity is important. I think that, I mean, this is true for any sort of creative endeavor that you're doing. If my message to my marketing team is it's about the horrors of war, and I'm not specific about where the game is set, like if it's set in Belgium versus the Ukraine, or St. Petersburg,
Rwanda,
or someplace
where everybody's
like,
getting chopped up with machetes, right?
Right. If I'm not specific about that, then they will not know. Right. So, and it's up to me as the game designer, as the creative person, to make sure everybody's on board with what I'm doing and on the same page.
And even if you make the choice not to communicate it proactively, you will get the questions.
Yes.
Especially if you're referring to history. You will get the questions about why this history, are you accurate in your history, and so on.
Right.
You will get the questions. Make sure that you have the answers.
That's right. And some of the questions might be really, really hard to answer. Like, why is it that you are doing this?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a really right. What gives you the right to tell this story, right? Is this kind of idea, right?
Right. And so going back to the example you had, what gave him the right was that he was telling the story about his grandmother. He wasn't telling the story about a grandmother who lived in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
He didn't know anything about that.
I think there was no fault of his, but it just shows you have 2 lines on Steam saying what this war is about, and he said it's about my grandmother. Nobody would have bought it.
Right.
If he says it's about the horrors of World War II, people get interested to it. And then
right. Although when you say, if you say it's about my grandmother's experiences with the horrors of World War II, then all of a sudden it's a lot more interesting, to me at least, because it's not a generic statement. It becomes a very specific statement, and I'm much more interested in a specific statement.
And notice this is an issue where this seems like an easy fix, right? Where you have like a compelling idea, the horrors of of the world as experienced by my grandma, right? Very, very, very clear. But a lot of times with misrepresentation, you're misrepresenting by omission. Right. And in this case, it seems omitting this particular idea that this is about, a specific person's journey seems like an easy fix. A lot of times it's really isn't. Right. So I'm thinking of, I think in the back of my mind, I think the hardest game to be made today by far is a game about the birth of Israel. I mean, kudos to whoever has the balls to make that game. Right. Because obviously, there's this is 70 years ago. So, I mean, this is just post-World War. And of course, it's going to, extend itself to, the late 19th century, minimally. So it's a long time ago in that sense, but it still has lots and lots of sensitivities involved. And almost any way you tell the story, you're going to omit certain things that people are going to think are causing you to misrepresent the story, or misrepresent what actually happened. Any advice if somebody is out there listening and they're like, I really want to make that game, right? How can you do that ethically in a way that when you're taking as a story is a piece of history as controversial as that?
Well, yeah, you picked about. I think you're completely right. That would be the most difficult historical game to make. There are good seconds, but I think it would be number one. How you do that ethically? You will never get it 100% right, because nobody gets it 100% right in history. So the basics is still, you have to be very clear about your choices. The other thing is, especially in those cases, you need to get people who have suffered the consequences, who still lived through the consequences of that history. You have to get them on board, talk to them, make sure that you have included their perspective in your process, not necessarily in your game. That is your freedom of choice. but you have to make sure that you've done your research with those people involved. And this is a personal perspective on similar cases. Let's take a game or any historical product that deals with colonial history. Let's take Belgian colonial history.
Sure.
I try to make the distinction, am I talking about something that nobody, not me, not anyone living at least, has suffered direct consequences of? I can take some distance and say, okay, I'm fine talking about this without reaching out. I can take my perspective as a professional historian and work from there. If there are still people alive who have suffered consequences of what happened, I am much more careful in what I do and say. I actually have, in terms of Belgian colonial history, I have a grandfather who stayed for a period in the Belgian Congo. Nobody's really sure, not even his children, what he exactly did there. We have not very terrible, but let's say also not very nice at certain cases. That's sort of the thing we get. I've not delved into that case, but I have no problem in mentioning that. Even, let's say, make excuses or talk to people who might have encountered my grandfather. That means people of my age who might have their grandfather or father encountered my grandfather or someone like him who suffered from those consequences of what happened in that period. I have to take a very humble position about that towards those people who were at the bottom of that colonial system that my grandfather helped or participated in. So if you're making a game about those certain cases, the one thing I would say that you have to do ethically is take a very, very humble position. So take your Israel case, be very, very humble towards everyone that you're trying to discuss or talk to, or not even include, but that might have had something to do with the actual history that you're discussing. Right. Regardless of who you are or where you're coming from, just be very, very humble.
That's a very good point. The colonialism. So just taking the colonialism as a sort of a broader stroke, there's tons and tons and tons of games that are not set in any specific place, but they are set in a very specific period of colonialism. Because, that was an exciting time to be a European, sailing around the world and expanding empires, right? And there's tons and tons and tons of games about doing exactly this sort of stuff. So even though they're not specifically historical, but they do sort of present themselves in they use the trappings, they use sailing ships, they use, things that specify the moment in time that they are from, even though they don't necessarily fly a specific flag or even use a specific coastline or use a specific place. What are our ethical responsibilities in that regard?
I find that a more difficult case than more recent history, in the sense that and that has to do something with, although I'm relatively young, my age and the gap between when I started doing history, what was permissible and what is how we're doing history now, even academically. So let's take Assassin's Creed, Age of Empires 3, which are set in a colonial setting, certain games. I don't necessarily feel that in their time when they came out, those games did anything wrong or they misrepresented what history was to all of us, even though we indeed omitted or potentially omitted painful episodes of those histories and turned them into a fun game. I don't have a problem with those games now. I would shy away from a company recommending make something like Age of Empires 3 now again. If you want to use that colonial setting, again, be more careful. You don't need to be extremely humble in the cases of 19th and 20th century colonialism or Israel, but still, do not make a game about happy settlers, happy colonialists, happy Europeans dividing the world. Don't do that. Because those games did misrepresent history to a tremendous degree in erasing out indigenous people, into glorifying or simplifying and putting things that maybe shouldn't be glorified. I think we understand history better now. I think also groups have a right to point out that their perspective in history is being erased. So don't do that at this stage. Can you still make a game about, let's say, 16th, 17th, 18th century history, early 19th century history, as Victoria recently? Yes, of course you can do that.
Right. And honestly, if it's just a game about expanding and conquering, and then make it completely fictional. Set it in space. Set it in a fantasy world. Again, you go back to this. Well, what do you buy? What do you get with it? Well, you get a lot of shorthand, but it turns out that shorthand itself is problematic, right? Because the shorthand is leaving stuff out that we now know is being left out in the shorthand.
It's interesting because I'm thinking of I was thinking of colonial India, right? And the fantasy Westworld even had, right, the colonial India world where you could go in as if you were a Brit and go into that 19th century India, and I mean you're living out a fantasy in Westworld. And, we want to use those historical occasions to live out those fantasies. Now, that's the fun, right? But so should I interrupt that fun with a commentary on the evils of or the hardship of colonialism in India, the racism involved, right? The tyranny. I mean, it's to me because Bram, we started this, and at the heart of this is fun. Right. But, at the same time, we're preparing now to do an episode about adult games, and adult games are also fantasy. Right. Or a lot of them are fantasy. Right. So this is a kind of in some sense, I think, kind of a more general question about how much responsibility do we have when presenting someone with a fantasy that would include potentially unethical elements?
That is a very good question, and I hope that installment of the podcast can help answer them, because I think they're even more pertinent in that sector of video gaming than in historical games. It's on a case-by-case basis, but I think there are ways around just having a disclaimer or making you feel guilty at certain times when playing. It's about leveling out the balance. It's about also perhaps going a bit less or being a bit less historically accurate in certain cases and allowing a bit more agency to certain groups and so on than would be historically the case. You have that option. But especially in terms of colonialism, if you want to, let's say, for example, which I can imagine, not necessarily me personal, but I have some friends like this as well, whose family also was active in the Belgian Congo, and who do not really, that's a very big debate actually in Belgium at the moment, right? Like the colonial missionaries, they were heroes. And there was recently a book published by a colleague of me who said, like, okay, these missionaries, they actually really helped keeping that colonial system in place. It was very, very badly received because father missionary, an unmarried uncle or aunt in the family, was usually a hero. They came back from the Congo and all of these stories, and they were doing very good to the people there and so on and so on. That's the story people have in mind. So I still have, or I can imagine a lot of people who would really like a game like that, not necessarily being a missionary in the Congo, but like be a hero in the Congo, bringing civilization and so on. That's an appealing narrative that really would resonate, that would be recognizable, offers a lot of the shorthands. But what you still then, I think, as a developer, if you want to be truthful to history, or more or less truthful, we've discussed it, but if you want to make the ethical choice there, neither my grandfather, neither those missionaries, neither any one of the people who were active in Congo were there on their own. There were local people with their own stories, their own histories with whom they interacted. You can show these people. You can show them in a decent way. You can allow them agency, even in a horrible system, or even in a system where the player is still at the top of a hierarchy, which is what gaming is a lot about. It's about I'm at the bottom or the middle of my reality or my real hierarchy. I want to be the Duke of Brabant now. I can feel more powerful.
Or in your
That is what
case, you
gaming
want to be
is.
Emperor of Europe because you're.
Yes, I'm not even
right?
satisfied with being a duke in the game. I want to be the emperor in that game with that specific duchy. But it is about living out a fantasy and being someone more powerful or more attractive or whatever than you are in reality. But even if you're offering that as a company, there are ways. You shouldn't shy away from the absolute. You shouldn't go for the absolute fantasy of being all powerful. There are other ways to include people with their own narratives, bring their story forward. And even if you have a game that is disbalanced towards one side of the story, as long as it's there, and as long as you acknowledge that my grandfather, these other missionaries or people with missionaries in their families, they weren't there on their own. This wasn't a blank slate, than which the frontier narrative in the US, of course, that this wasn't a blank slate, and you make that clear. Even though players are acting out their fantasy, in the back of their minds, there will always be this reference to, okay, there was something else, or there were other elements in place. They don't need to take front and center stage, and they don't need to be a red flag like, oh, and this atrocity happened, or this was unethical. But you can make them, you can still have them ask questions by including certain elements. Age of Empires 3, for example, include more indigenous factions, or that's what they should have done, make them sufficiently balanced and powerful, and so on, or whatever. You have options.
Yeah, it's interesting how you have lots of options in terms of whether to weave this stuff into the narrative or into the mechanics, or to add these videos between, while the game is loading, right? Or to have announcements right at the beginning. And it's interesting what is appropriate, depending on, again, this is very context oriented at that point.
But do it consciously. I think that is it. If you want to have one bottom line about dealing with history, please do it consciously. And if you're doing it consciously, you can do it responsibly.
Are there any games of history that you just should not tell? For example, I in my mind, I just came up with because once you get to fantasy, I mean, you get to some like, I want to play a historical simulation game where I'm a slave owner in antebellum South of the United States, and essentially I want to increase my yield by buying and breeding slaves. And enjoying all the other perks of being a slave owner, which means, raping my slaves, doing everything else I want. Notice, I mean, that is a dark potential fantasy game. And if it's not dark, well, it probably damn well should be dark, because, I mean, are there certain game about history that just should not be made? Or is there always a way to kind of, find a way to make it so that it's appropriately contextualizes everything, so you're not misrepresenting and you're not hurting anybody?
I know the answer to that for me, which is that there are absolutely games that should not be made by me. Right? That I don't have any right to talk about some of these things, right? Or it's been, my viewpoint on this has been so told it would just be hacky, right? It would just be like, we've been there, we've done that. We know what a 50-year-old white guy thinks about this particular situation.
Well, I think maybe the example, it's not a historical game, but I used it recently. The game was actually renamed, but the original title was Bully. Where you read
I remember it.
A school in the United Kingdom. Was a big fuss about it when I was in high school, because this is a game about, it actually starts by teaching you how to bully, and then you start to bully the bulliers. So there was a story of moral redemption there. But should you make a game that teaches you how to bully? Is that ethical to do? So that is the same question. Should you make a game that teaches you to be a slave owner? To be honest, I would have never made either of those games. I think other people should not do that as well, but it's not up to me to enforce that. In a free society, you are free to make a game about how to be a slave owner. Will I criticize you to death for that on multiple levels? Yes, I will. Will I recommend to buy it? Definitely not. But you are free to make that.
Right. And notice, right, the legal versus moral kind of, judgment here, right? I mean, legally, in some places, I'm assuming you can't, right? But legally, let's say you can. But there is this kind of interesting distinction here between are you teaching somebody something that's wrong, right? So let's say it's wrong to bully, or it's wrong to teach someone racism, right? Which is or it's wrong to teach someone to treat people as things, right? Though now we're getting to things like potentially rape games and things like that, right? Which again are meant to be fantasies, right? Which are acknowledged that is, but notice again how that's separate from the history itself, right? Is it okay to put you in a position where historically, right, that might have been your life, and how would you do it in that context? And obviously, this is, not a game anyone is gonna make, and I think really should make. Yeah.
No, but you're right, because you could make the argument, and that is a valid argument, by the way. I'll narrow it down a bit, but you can't make the argument that not making such a game is also a misrepresentation of history. Let's say, but that's not what games are designed for. I mean, games are not designed to offer us a better understanding and view of history. So you can leave out certain types of games where you don't go to.
But they can, be. Or again, we might get, there's a million different potential reasons for a game, aren't there?
Yeah. Okay, for sure. And I'm talking mostly about the popular segment. But you're right. You could make it a game about slave ownership, colonialism, even the Holocaust, that is educational and deals with that topic. So you of course you can do it. And there you're right. It's again content, context, intent, and so on that determines that. So fundamentally, is there a topic that you shouldn't make a game about? No. There are certain types of history that you shouldn't use for certain types of games. That is the one thing.
It's a nice way to put it.
Yeah.
It becomes more interesting though in game, because again we are free to make all of the games that we want for all of the sort of intentions that we want, and the bottom line is you have to deal with the consequences. You're responsible for your own output. Own it, even if it causes problems.
Right.
It becomes more interesting when it's in the game itself. For example, can you make a game about the U.S. Civil War? I'm not a specialist, so I apologize if I make mistakes on this topic as well. But can you make a game about the U.S. Civil War that excludes aspects of the slavery economy? Can you do that? Can you have a northern faction, a southern faction, and the southern faction has an economic structure where you do not reference slavery as a premise or even an element of your economy? Right. I think you will very soon encounter the valid argument that is a thorough distortion of history and the US Civil War. So what is your your ethical responsibility there in that game, leaving the fun part and so on aside? Is it to avoid the painful aspects, at least those painful aspects, of the Civil War? Or is it to be more truthful, to be more accurate, and do you include it? I do not really have an immediate answer to that question. It depends on what do you prioritize, and you will encounter players who say, I prioritize accuracy, so I demand that it's there. And you will have players who say, I know this is, and that's a very common response, I know this is a very painful history and I don't want to be distracted by that, so please do leave it out. That is actually happens a lot of time with the Holocaust case, that a lot of players who play World War II games say, I don't want it included because I know that it is a part of World War II, I know it's painful, but I want my fun, I don't want to be distracted by it. And then you have players who create mods to include elements of the Holocaust. Usually not really for the right reasons, I can add. It is more historically accurate, but let's say there is an agenda behind that accuracy. But both takes are there. Both questions are both arguments are out there in terms of historical games.
All right, Bram, this has been great. What do you want to leave our listeners with?
It's actually two things. One is that have your fun with history in games. That's the main thing. And the second one is don't trust the history in the games. It's never as accurate, never as correct as you think it is or as it want to be. It's very carefully designed, so know that when you're playing a historical game.
All right, Bram De Ridder, that was well said. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you guys.
All
Thank
right.
you guys.
Good podcast, guys. GP. Play nice, everybody. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.